BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thanks for listening to the Farming Today podcast. I'm Caz Graham. Coming up, in the week that thousands of farmers took to the streets of London, we ask if the government will change its mind on changes to inheritance tax.
You can't just store the change forever because there are some people that are going to find it difficult.
But first, how many cattle would you expect to find on a farm? 100? 200? Well, BBC research recently found that there are currently almost 950 farm operations in the UK with more than 700 dairy or beef cattle. There's a global trend for farms to scale up and intensify their production, and the UK is no different. In a couple of minutes, we're going to hear more about why it's happening and the impact it's having. But first, let's hear from a Yorkshire farmer who fattens 4,000 cattle a year in pens. He reckons with this intensive system, he can produce beef more efficiently and in half the time of extensively grazed farming systems. Sarah Falkingham has been to see Doug Deer on his farm near Selby in North Yorkshire.
So these beasts are just walking past us here, having a bit of a stretch of the legs, and behind them are the really large farm sheds, mostly open-sided for the ventilation, and within them you've got about 1,600 cattle
1,600 cattle on farm, building up the pen size now to hold 120 cattle apiece of one customer's.
I can see some rations here just in a row outside where they stick their heads through the grate. What's that a mix of?
So basically we're on 75 to 80% homegrown produce, so there's wheat, barley, straw, forage maize in there, crimped maize on occasion, fodder beet, and then the remainder of the ration is made up of co-products. We're using dark distillers grains from the alcohol industry, wheat syrup again from the alcohol industry, out-of-spec potatoes and surplus bread and Yorkshire puddings.
Yorkshire puddings for Yorkshire cattle, right.
Yeah.
So it's not come farm, most of this feed, and no imported soya?
No, not allowed to use soya, and we haven't used soya for probably 10 years now.
The lifespan of these cattle is about maybe half what it would be up on a hill, and that cuts down methane emissions. But if you take the cereal production carbon emissions, where do you stand there on the whole carbon footprint of these animals?
Well, obviously we're growing cereals on our own land, and all the muck is being recycled back through the cereals, so we're not using, well, we're way down on stats for nitrogen. We haven't put any P&K on the farm in the last 20 years, I would say. So it's majorly efficient. We're using the product to grow cereals at the cheapest price.
People coming here might expect to see, the cattle outside. Some of these cattle have been outside. They've had a summer outside on grass.
Yeah.
Some haven't.
Yeah.
Is it better for the animals to be inside from a welfare point of view?
Well, as you can see, they've got the choice because we've got big yards. They can either stand outside in the front of the open yard or go under the shed when either it's too hot or it's, inclement weather. I can't see any problem with cattle being housed inside for the last 90 to 120 days of their life.
Do you think this is the future then? More indoor housing, less extensive grazing?
There's always a place for grass in the life cycle of cattle because obviously we need to grow the frame so that we can hang the meat on it, but if you want to actually get the cover on the animal, they're going to have to come inside at some point in their lifetime and be fed a high starch diet to hit the supermarket spec.
That's farmer Doug Deer talking to Sarah Falkingham. Well, intensive farming is something we've been looking into all week on Farming Today, which goes out each weekday morning at 5:45 here on BBC Radio 4. So what exactly is it? I asked Jude Capper, Professor of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production at Harper Adams University.
Intensive farming's a difficult one because it's quite an emotive subject, so it tends to mean different things to different people. But it generally means housed livestock finishing or getting to their slaughter weight in a relatively shorter time compared to more extensive systems out on pasture and grassland. In the UK and indeed across the globe, we've seen a growing trend towards bigger farms, more consolidated farms. We've got fewer, total farms across the UK and across the world. And that's often because of efficiencies, economies of scale, older people going out of business and their farms being bought up by bigger farms. But I think it's really important to understand that big doesn't mean bad, as it were.
OK, because, people often worry about whether things like animal welfare suffers on intensive farms, particularly where, say, livestock lives indoors all year round. Is there any basis for those worries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And welfare really is the only bit that we don't know all the answers to yet. There's quite a lot of data out there that shows that it depends what the animal's used to. If the animal hasn't ever been outside, it doesn't necessarily want to go outside. And there's been some really interesting work in broiler chickens, for example, to show that if you give them access, often they don't actually want it. And we've shown the same in dairy cattle at Harper Adams. Ultimately, if we want a sustainable food system, we've got to look for really good health and welfare as well as productivity going forwards.
What impact does intensification, keeping animals indoors, have on carbon emissions and other environmental impacts like, say, biodiversity?
That's a really good question. On average, and I am saying on average, intensive systems tend to have a lower carbon footprint because those animals grow faster there on the planet for a shorter amount of time. The carbon footprint and the resource use, so land, water, fertilisers, etc., tends to be lower. But of course, if they're housed inside, they can't be having the positive impacts on biodiversity, for example, soil quality, soil health, that we'd see with a pasture-based system. So we've got this dichotomy between what do we care about more? Is it carbon footprint? Is it biodiversity? Is it landscape maintenance? It sort of almost comes down to what does the consumer value most? And indeed, of course, what does the processor and government value most as well?
Professor Jude Capper. Well, the consumer wants chicken. There is a huge demand in the UK for affordable chicken meat, and birds reared to feed that market are called broiler chickens, raised specifically for meat rather than for laying eggs. Many are farmed intensively. 40,000 birds all in one shed, killed and processed at around 6 weeks old. To some, it's a controversial method of rearing poultry, but to others, it's a perfectly humane way of meeting the British public's appetite for affordable chicken. Our reporter Howard Shannon has been to meet Peter Kendall, who produces chicken in broiler sheds on the Bedfordshire-Cambridgeshire border.
So that's a little inspection hatch for you. Now in front of us are one of the 8 broiler sheds. So what's the capacity of each of these sheds?
It really does depend on the market at the time. We've had times when they've had more birds in the sheds, but at the moment we currently place about 43,000 eggs where we're using the nest spawn system, so we're hatching within the sheds. By the time we've finished the hatch, we're probably ending up with just over 40,000 birds in a shed. They're a very specific breed. These birds are bred for table meat. They do grow in quite a rapid time period, and I'm very conscious that's one of the criticisms people have over the farming system, but for actually value for money, it's unbeatable.
Now, there has been criticism that the chickens are growing so quickly that their legs don't keep up with their body mass and they can't even stand.
I think that's an outdated criticism. The genetics have generally really marched on an enormous amount, even in the time that we've been rearing broiler chickens. So it's not an issue unless you get an infection in the birds at an early age, and then they might go off their legs, but that's not to do with the skeleton not being able to carry them anymore. So it's a different challenge, and that really is very minimal in this day and age.
Okay, let's go inside one of the houses.
We've got a viewing gallery here. We ought to just dip our boots.
What's the purpose of the viewing gallery?
Basically to show you and anyone that we're not embarrassed about what we're doing, and we're really keen to share what technology is involved and what we're trying to achieve.
So what's the life cycle of one of these chickens?
The integrators we work with, which is Cranswick, they will take probably 15% of the birds out of a shed at about day 29, 30, and then we'll clear the remaining birds in the shed anywhere between day 36 and 39.
And those birds, do they go to slaughter and go to the food chain?
Yeah, there's a demand for lighter birds, so the ones we've been taking out the last few crops have been going at anywhere between 1.7 and 1.9 kilos at thin, and then when they're fully cleared at maturity, they will be going then at 2.5 to maybe 2.8 kilos. You know, no livestock benefits from not being nurtured and pampered and looked after the best possible way. So I do find the criticism from some of the animal rights people, a bit unhelpful, because actually it makes economic sense to look after animals really well. That's not to say that we're not going to learn new techniques and new methods to improve further down the line. And I think the industry drives those standards. Consumers are also pushing hard, but the market has to understand, as we move, and we're due to move to lower stocking in these sheds from the beginning of next year, that either means we've got to build more sheds somewhere in the UK or import it. And at the same time, the costs are going to go up.
Poultry farmer Peter Kendall. Well, the global trend for farm intensification is not one that's welcomed by everyone. The campaign group Sustain argues for food produced to high welfare standards in a way that protects nature and tackles climate change. Ruth Westcott from Sustain told Charlotte Smith that means eating less meat, not intensifying production.
We think we need to really stop and avoid rationalising intensive livestock farming systems just because they have a lower greenhouse gas emissions profile than more extensive livestock systems. Intensive livestock has a much higher greenhouse gas emissions profile than other sources of protein. We can't simply pretend that this form of agriculture is good for the climate or good for the planet. There is a very complex set of environmental and social impacts that we need to consider with intensive livestock farming, and that particularly includes river pollution. 2/3 of our rivers fail to reach good ecological status due to agriculture, and some new research that we revealed just a couple of weeks ago show that intensive livestock units produce over 30,000 of tonnes of waste every day. Waste is being spread on fields, and we know
that's when it's being used as a fertiliser. That's the whole point. Muck is magic.
Ideally, that would be the case. We want to see farm waste being used as a way to fertilise fields, but unfortunately, the volume of waste that's being produced has gone up so much, especially from intensive livestock systems. And we've seen an increasing attention on the fact that agriculture is a source of river pollution, but we want to make sure that it's the right people that are getting blamed for the pollution. And these corporations are kind of washing their hands of the problem and leaving farmers to deal with it.
Fundamentally, doesn't this come down to money and to consumers? Consumers will decide how much they want to spend, and that decides how farmers farm.
From the consumer side, even though they say they want to buy sustainable food and they want to buy high welfare food, the fact is that their incomes are being squeezed, which means that the power that they have to make ethical choices is becoming less and less. And we think the solution to this is to make sustainable and healthy food more accessible and more affordable to those on low incomes. And there's ways to do that are relatively easy. If you look at public procurement, the government's promised to buy 50% local and sustainable. Let's get that happening now.
Ruth Westcott from Sustain. Now, to a story that hasn't been far from the headlines for 3 weeks now, and the reason thousands of farmers took to the streets of London this week. Farmers are angry because from April 2026, farms will have to pay 20% inheritance tax on assets over £1 million. The government says that figure could be more like £3 million by using certain tax allowances. And they point out that you could gift a farm to the next generation and pay nothing if you go on to live for another 7 years. But farmers are convinced that the change threatens the future of family farms. On Tuesday, you may just have noticed, there was a protest in Westminster and also an event hosted by the NFU to lobby MPs. Anna Hill was at both.
The human impact of this policy is simply not acceptable. It's wrong.
Well, that was Tom Bradshaw, president of the National Farmers Union, and the day began with farmers gathering here at Church House just next to Westminster Abbey, where farmers were arranging to meet their MPs later in the day to explain to them exactly how this inheritance tax would affect their individual farm.
Dawn Gemmell from Huddersfield. I feel utterly betrayed. My husband died a couple of years ago and I farm in partnership with my sons. It's roulette as to whether you live 7 years, and then the next generation, it's Russian roulette again with them as to whether they will live 7 years.
Jason Silk. We're just a small family farm based in Bramdean, just outside Winchester. I think it just comes down to the fact that we just don't physically have the money there to be able to do that. If we sold up, then yes, you could realise that sort of money, but then it's gone.
Henry Graham, and we farm on a family farm outside Newbury. I'm currently the younger generation coming on, wanting to do more, and is actively discouraging growth of a family business.
Tom, we're standing in the chamber where you spoke. You actually got quite emotional when you were speaking about your family.
I think they've completely missed the human impact of this policy. And look, money's one thing, but people is something that I can't give up on. I don't believe that it's what the government meant to happen, but the longer they lock down, the more it feels vindictive rather than just a mistake. They have got to sit round the table with us and come forwards with a full consultation.
Outside of this chamber, it is chock-a-block all the way up Whitehall. Do you think the action taken by farmers here today might force the hand of the Chancellor to actually have a meeting with you?
I've tried not to force anybody's hand. We've tried to sort this out amicably. I've written a heartfelt letter to the Chancellor to try and help her understand the unintended consequences. My door's open, my phone's on. We'd love to have a call, we'd love to have a meeting, but the ball is firmly in the government's court.
I've walked up now through Whitehall. I could hardly get through the crowds, I have to say. We've been walking for quite a long time, weaving our way, and as you can hear, they are angry, they are concerned, they're worried. Well, Clive Bailey, the influencer and organiser, I suppose, of this rally.
Farmers just don't know what to do. They're desperate. They needed this. They need that outlet.
And what about the knock-on then from this? How you reach out to ordinary people who are not farmers, who might be listening to this and saying, well, hang on a minute, farmers are getting a lower inheritance tax burden than anyone else, so why are they complaining?
Farmers aren't special. We're no more special than any other part of society or any other occupation, but our businesses are very different. And the difference of a farming business is there's embarrassingly low returns on the capital employed. We have huge amounts often tied up in the assets needed to farm, but we can't pay tax from them without selling them. And that's why most of these farms are going to end up having to be sold to pay these tax bills. And then who's going to buy them? Farming became uninvestable at that budget, didn't it? So no one's going to buy land to farm now. It's going to be bought by the institutional, the corporate investors that are interested in development opportunity, energy projects, biodiversity net gain, carbon offset, those kind of things. Huge buyers.
What happens after this?
I've got concerns about what happens next. I mean, we had no idea it would be this big. So if they're willing to do that, is this just a warm-up act for bigger things?
Well, what bigger things, though?
Well, there's the more militant amongst the farming community. They've seen what happened in Europe. They've seen the kind of French farmers and German farmers. They saw the action they've taken, and they've seen it work. So, there are people that want to go that way. Now, I'd prefer we could just sit down with government, try and explain, make them understand and find a solution to the problem. They've got a black hole to fill, fine. Let's find a better solution.
Clive Bailey ending that report from Anna Hill in London. Well, one of the arguments around the new tax is centred on just how many farmers will have to pay it. Farmers claim around 2/3 of family farms will be affected by this change. But the Treasury says 73% of APR claims will not be affected. Our producer Heather Simons has been looking into it, and it is complicated, isn't it, Heather?
It certainly is. And I'll start off with a couple of three-letter acronyms for you, Caz. APR is Agricultural Property Relief, and BPR is Business Property Relief. Before the new rules come into force in April 2026, farm business owners can claim 100% APR and BPR when passing on the business to their relatives upon death, i.e. no inheritance tax. Now, that relief has been reduced, meaning, as we've covered, inheritance tax will be introduced on agricultural businesses worth more than £1 million. The thing that makes this all confusing is that APR and BPR are a bit interchangeable. One farm business can claim both reliefs on different aspects of the property. And on some things, like the value of land and farm buildings, you could claim APR or BPR.
So why is that relevant?
Well, it means that figures looking at just APR don't tell the whole story. The government has been using this 73% figure, for example, but that is about APR claims. Specifically, 73% of the APR claims in the year 2021-22 were on less than £1 million worth of assets. So the Treasury says they won't be impacted by the change in the rules. But you could have someone claiming less than £1 million in APR, but also claiming, for the sake of argument, £3 million in BPR. They would count towards that 73% figure of people who the Treasury say wouldn't be impacted by the change in the rules. But of course they would be impacted in the change because the £1 million threshold is across both reliefs. So that 73% figure is just not very meaningful when it comes to the concerns being raised by farmers. It's also worth noting that a lot of the people claiming APR won't be farmers. The Treasury pointed out to me that some of the claims for a small amount of APR might just refer to a couple of horses in a paddock or a tractor for managing a field at the bottom of the garden, bumping up that proportion of claims that are on less than £1 million worth of assets.
So do we know how many farmers will be affected then?
Well, not really. I did try to get more relevant figures, but it's hard, to be honest. The Treasury has made predictions for claims that they think will be made from 2026 when the new rules come in. And they predict from the estates claiming some combination of APR and BPR, either just one or the other or both, there will be 2,000 affected by the changes and 3,100 unaffected. Of the 2,000 affected, the Treasury tell me 1,000 are to do with something called AIM shares, and they're nothing to do with farm businesses, so we'll leave them to one side. That leaves 1,000 claimants impacted, but there's nothing to say how many of them are farms and how many are other types of business being passed on to family, because that data isn't collected, so basically we don't know.
The NFU, National Farmers Union, they say that the change is going to affect the majority of farms. How have they come to that conclusion?
Yeah, and that's not straightforward either, to be honest, because they're basing their calculations on DEFRA data about the value of farm business assets. They say 2/3 of farms are worth more than £1 million, so could be affected. And if you take out some of those estates claiming APR which aren't farms that I mentioned earlier, the NFU suggests it could be as much as 75% of farmers impacted. And at first glance, that feels more relevant. But some farm businesses have multiple owners, family members, for example. So for the sake of argument, you could have a farm business worth £5 million, but if it's owned equally by 5 family members, then they each own £1 million worth. So would all be able to pass that on without paying inheritance tax. So that data also doesn't really get to the bottom of the question.
Heather, thank you very much for digging into those figures. And Heather is not the only one who's been digging further into the detail on this story, because our very own Charlotte Smith has been on a bit of a road trip, touring the country over the last fortnight, talking to farmers and experts for a programme all about this controversial tax change. It's called Inheriting the Earth, and you can hear it here on BBC Radio 4 tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. Amongst others, she has been speaking to the DEFRA Secretary, Steve Reed, about the anger and fear some farmers are feeling.
You can't just stall the change forever because there are some people that are going to find it difficult. You know, the figures we've looked at show that the vast majority will not be paying anything more in any case. So I'm aware there's a high level of concern about this. I think those concerns are unrealistic, if I'm really honest, in many, many cases.
What is the aim of this? It doesn't raise that much money. It doesn't put off investors. It doesn't make land available for farmers when it's put up, because any farmer buying it will face the same inheritance tax problem as the person selling it. What is the aim of this? What are you trying to achieve?
When you say it doesn't raise much money, you're talking about £500 million. £500 million can buy an awful lot of doctors and nurses to try and get our NHS working. That is the primary reason why we've taken the decision that we're taking. But also, I want to discourage non-farmers from coming in and buying agricultural land. I don't think it's right that the very wealthy investors in the city come in and buy up agricultural land just because, as it has been up until now, the most efficient way of shielding their wealth from their own inheritance tax liability, because that is pushing up land values to a point where young farmers wanting to fulfil their dream of owning a farm can't afford to buy the land.
But this doesn't change that. It's still a better deal to invest in land than other things.
We're trying to balance the need to tackle that with trying to be fair to working farms. If we'd abolished entirely any tax-exempt element within this, then people would rightly be furious because 100% of farming estates would have been caught in it. Well, as it is, I think it will be roughly a quarter, and even that quarter, if they take professional advice, can be reduced still further.
DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed. And a reminder, you can catch that programme all about this issue tomorrow lunchtime at 1:30 and afterwards on BBC Sounds. Just search for Inheriting the Earth. But that's it from the farming team for now. I'm Caz Graham. The producer is Heather Simons. And Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.